Though the sound of the wind roared and thundered about the house, making whatever disturbed, nothing whatever disturbed the trees before my eyes. Not a leaf, not a treetop, not a twig swayed so much as a hair's breadth. Good God, I exclaimed, and fell back, away from the pane, as if to shut the sight from my eyes. Now you see, he said, stepping back from the window. I have heard all this before. He stood quietly as if waiting, and I too waited. The sound of the wind continued unabated. It had by this time reached a frightful intensity, so that it seemed as if the old house must be torn from the hillside and hurtled into the valley below. Indeed, a faint trembling made itself manifest, even as I thought this, a strange tremor, as if the house were shuddering, and the pictures on the walls made a slight, almost stealthy movement, almost imperceptible, and yet quite unmistakably visible. I glanced at Frolin, but his features were not disquieted. He continued to stand, listening and waiting, so that it was patient that the end of this singular manifestation was not yet. The wind's sound was now a terrible, demoniac howling, and it was accompanied by notes of music which must have been audible for some time, but were so perfectly blended with the wind's voice that I was not at first aware of them. The music was similar to that which had gone before, as of pipes and occasionally stringed instruments, but was now much wilder, sounding with a terrifying abandon, and with the character of unmentionable evil about it. At the same time, two further manifestations occurred. The first was the sound as of someone walking, some great being whose footsteps seemed to flow into the room from the heart of the wind itself. Certainly they did not originate in the house, though there was about them the unmistakable swelling which betokened their approach to the house. The second was the sudden change in temperature. The night outside was warm for September in upstate Wisconsin, and the house, too, had been reasonably comfortable. Now, abruptly coincident with the approaching footsteps, the temperature began to drop rapidly, so that in a little while the air in the room was cold, and both Frolin and I had to put on more clothing in order to keep comfortable. This, still, did not seem to be the height of the manifestations for which Frolin so obviously waited. He continued to stand, saying nothing, though his eyes, meeting mine from time to time, were eloquent enough to speak his mind. How long we stood there listening to those frightening sounds from outside before the end came, I do not know. But suddenly Frolin caught my arm and in a hoarse whisper cried, There they are, listen." The tempo of the weird music had changed abruptly to a diminuendo from its previous wild crescendo. There came into it now a strain of almost unbearable sweetness, and with a little of melancholy to it, the music, as lovely as previously it had been evil. Well, good and bad are not really how to determine evil. Well, I mean, negative and positive, pleasant, unpleasant. And yet the note of terror was not completely absent. At the same time, there was apparent the sound of voices raised in a kind of swelling chant, rising from the back of the house somewhere, as if from the study. "Great God in heaven," I cried, seizing Frolin. "What is it now?" "It's grandfather's doing," he said. "Whether he knows it or not, that thing comes and sings to him." He shook his head and closed his eyes tightly for an instant, before saying bitterly in a low, intense voice, "If only that accursed paper of Leander's had been burned as it ought to have been." "You could almost make out the woods," I said, listening intently. There were words, but not words I'd ever heard before, a kind of horrible, primeval mouthing, as if some bestial creature, with but half a tongue, ululated syllables of meaningless horror. I went over and opened the door. Immediately the sound seemed clearer, so that it was evident that what I had mistaken for many voices was but one, which could nevertheless convey the illusion of many. Words, or perhaps I had better write sounds. Bestial sounds rose from below, a kind of awe-inspiring ululation. We see the prejudice in the way this is phrased of languages other than English. English has somehow figured out how, the various fields of the science, as in particular and stuff, has figured out how to incorporate over 200 vocal sounds. But whether you're using all of them or a part of them, saying, "Oh, this doesn't sound," there's a lot of this making fun of people because of their language. Itaqwa, gat ayak, volgatmam, ahag, katolu, fatagan, shub, nigroth, itaqwa, naflaf hatagan. Incredibly, the wind's voice rose to howl even more terribly, so that I thought at any moment the house would be hurled into the void, and Frolin and myself torn from its rooms, and the breath sucked from out of our helpless bodies. In the confusion of fear and wonder that held me, I thought that at an instant of grandfather in the study below, and beckoning Frolin, I ran from the room to the stairs, determined, despite my ghastly fright, to put myself between the old man and whatever menaced him. I ran to his door and flung myself upon it, and once more, as before, all manifestations stopped, as if by the flick of a switch. Silence fell like a pall of darkness upon the house, a silence that was momentarily even more terrible. The door gave, and once more I faced grandfather. He was sitting still as we had left him but a short time before, though now his eyes were open and his head was cocked a little to one side, and his gaze was fixed upon the overlarge painting on the east wall. "In God's name," I cried. "What was that?" "I hope to find out before long," he answered, with great dignity and gravity. His utter lack of fear quieted my own alarm to some degree, and I came a little farther into the room, Frolin following. I leaned over his bed, striving to fix his attention upon me, but he continued to gaze at the painting with singular intensity. "What are you doing?" I demanded. "Whatever it is, there's danger in it. An explorer like your grandfather would hardly be content if there were not, my boy," he replied crisply, matter-of-factly. I knew it was true. I would rather die with my boots on than here in this bed. He went on. "As for what we heard, I don't know how much of it you heard. That's something for a moment not yet explicable. But I would call to your attention the strange action of the wind." "There was no wind," I said. I looked. Yes, he said a little impatiently. "True enough, and yet the wind sound was there, and all the voices of the wind, just as I have heard, singing in Mongolia, in the great snowy spaces, over the shunned and hidden plateaus of Leng, where the Tcho people worship strange, ancient entities." He turned to face me suddenly, and I thought his eyes feverish. "I did tell you, didn't I, about the worship of Itaqua, sometimes called Windwalker, and by some surely the Wendigo, by certain Indians in Upper Manitoba, and of their beliefs that the Windwalker takes human sacrifices and carries them over the far places of the earth before leaving them behind, dead at last. Oh, there are stories, my boy, odd legends, and something more." He leaned toward me now with a fierce intensity. "I have myself seen things found on a body, dropped from the air. Just that, things could not possibly have been gotten in Manitoba, things belonging to Lang, to the Pacific Isles." He brushed me away with one arm, and an expression of disgust crossed his face. "You don't believe me. You think I'm wandering. Go on then. Go back to your little sleep and wait for your last through the eternal misery of monotonous day after day." "No, say it now. I'm in no mood to go." "I will talk to you in the morning," he said tiredly, leaning back. With that, I had to be contented. He was adamant, and could not be moved. I bade him good night once more and retreated into the hall with Frolin, who stood there shaking his head slowly, forbiddingly. "Every time a little worse," he whispered. "Every time the wind blows a little louder, the cold comes more intensely, the voices and the music more clearly, and the sound of those terrible footsteps He turned away, and I began to retrace the way upstairs, and after a moment of hesitation, I followed. In the morning, my grandfather looked his unusual picture of good health. Oh, his usual picture of good health. At the moment of my entrance into the dining room, he was speaking to Hoff, apparently in answer to a request, for the old servant stood respectfully bowed while he heard grandfather tell him that he and Mrs. Hoff might indeed take a week off beginning today. If it was necessary for Mrs. Hoff's health, that she go to Wausau to consult a specialist. Frolin met my eyes with a grim smile. His color had faded a little, leaving him pale and sleepless looking, but he ate heartily enough. His smile and the brief indicative glance of his eyes toward Hoff's retreating back said clearly that this necessity which had come upon Hoff and his wife was their way of fighting the manifestations which had so disturbed my own first night in the house. "Well, my boy," said grandfather quite cheerfully, "you are not looking nearly as haggard as you did last night. I confess I felt for you. I dare say, also, you aren't nearly so skeptical as you were." He chuckled, as if this were a subject for joking. I could not, unfortunately, feel the same way about it. I sat down and began to eat a little, glancing at him from time to time, waiting for him to begin his explanation of the strange events of the previous night. Since it became evident shortly that he did not intend to explain, I was impelled to ask for an explanation, and did so with as much dignity as possible. "I'm sorry if you've been disturbed," he said. "The fact of the matter is that the threshold of which Leander wrote must be in that study somewhere, and I felt quite certain I was onto it last night, before you burst into my room the second time. Furthermore, it seemed undisputable that at least one member of the family has had traffic with one of those beings. Leander, obviously." Frolin leaned forward. "Do you believe in them?" Grandfather smiled unpleasantly. "It must be obvious that, whatever my abilities, the disturbance you heard last night could hardly have been caused by me." "Yes, of course," agreed Frolin. "But some other agency." No, it remains to be determined only which one. The water smells are the sign of the spawn of Cthulhu, but the winds might be Laoigor, or Ethaqua, or Hastur. But the stars aren't right for Hastur," he went on. "So we are left with the other two. They are there, then and one of them just across that threshold. I want to know what lies beyond that threshold if I can find it." It seemed incredible that my grandfather should be talking so unconcernedly about these ancient beings. His prosaic air was in itself almost as alarming as has been the night's occurrences. The temporary feeling of security I had at the sight of him eating breakfast was washed away. I began to be conscious again of that slowly growing fear I had known on my way to the house last evening, and I regretted having pushed my inquiry. If my grandfather were aware of anything of this, he made no sign. He went on talking much in the manner of a lecturer, pursuing a scientific inquiry for the benefit of an audience before him. It was obvious, he said, that a connection existed between the happenings at Innsmouth and Leander Alwyn's non-human contact outside. Did Leander leave Innsmouth originally because of the cult of Cthulhu that existed there? Because he, too, was becoming afflicted with that curious facial change which overtook many of the inhabitants of accursed Innsmouth, those strange Bactrian lineaments which horrified the federal investigators who came to examine into the Innsmouth affair. Perhaps this was so. In any event, leaving the Cthulhu cult behind, he had made his way into the wilds of Wisconsin and somehow had established contact with another of the elder beings, Laoigor, or Ethaqua, all to be noted elemental forces of evil. Leander Alwyn was apparently a wicked man. If there's any truth to this, I cried, then surely Leander's warning ought to be observed. Give up this mad hope of finding the threshold of which he writes. Grandfather gazed at me for a moment, with speculative mildness, but it was plain to see that he was not actually concerning himself with my outburst. Now I've embarked upon this exploration. I mean to keep it. After all, Leander died a natural death. But following your own theory, he had traffic with these things, I said. You have none. You're daring to venture out into unknown space. It comes to that, without regard for what horrors might lie there. When I went into Mongolia, I encountered horrors too. I never thought to escape Lang with my life. He paused reflectively and then rose slowly. No, I mean to discover Leander's threshold. And tonight, no matter what you hear, try not to interrupt me. It would be a pity if after so long a time I am still further delayed by your impetuosity. And having discovered the threshold, I cried, what then? I'm not sure I'll want to cross it. The choice may not be yours. He looked at me for a moment in silence, smiled gently, and left the room. And in real life, spiritual protection and exorcism, there's general stuff, and that's important, and that should be sufficient, but sometimes it helps to know exactly what one's dealing with, particularly when we get into particulars of subjects and stuff that need to be brought up, or particular verses thereof, or areas, that one may need to address. In the events of that catastrophic night, I find it difficult, even at this late date, to write. So vividly do they return to mind, despite the prosaic surroundings of Miskatonic University, where so many of those dread secrets are hidden in ancient and little-known texts. And yet, to understand the widespread occurrences that came after the events of that night must be known. Frolin and I spent most of the day investigating my grandfather's books and papers in search of verification of certain legends he had hinted at in his conversation, not only with me, but in Frolin, even before my arrival. Throughout his work occurred many cryptic allusions, but only one narrative at all relative to our inquiry, a somewhat obscure story, clearly of legendary origin, concerning the disappearance of the two residents of Nelson, Manitoba, and a constable of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, and their subsequent reappearance as if dropped from the heavens, frozen and either dead or dying, babbling of Ithequah, of the Windwalker, and of many places on the face of the earth, and carrying with them strange objects, mementos of far places, which they had never been known to carry in life. The story was incredible, and yet it was related to the mythology so clearly put down in The Outsider and others, and even more horribly narrated in the Nakhotic manuscripts, the Rulia text, and the terrible Necronomicon. Apart from this, we found nothing tangible enough to relate to our problem, and we resigned ourselves to waiting for the night. At luncheon and dinner, we prepared by Frolin in the absence of the Hoffs. My grandfather carried on as normally. He was accustomed to making no reference to his strange exploration, beyond saying he now had definite proof that Leander had painted that unattractive landscape on the east wall of his study, and that he hoped soon, as he neared the end of deciphering Leander's long, rambling letter, to find the essential clue to that threshold of which he wrote, and to which he now alluded increasingly. When he rose from that dinner table, he solemnly cautioned us once more not to interrupt him in the night, under the pain of his extreme displeasure, and so departed into that study out of which he never walked again. Do you think you can sleep? Frolin asked me. When we were alone, I shook my head. Impossible, I'll stay up. I don't think he'd like us to stay downstairs, said Frolin, a faint frown on his forehead. In my room, then, I replied. And you? With you, if you don't mind. He means to see it through, and there is nothing we can do until he needs us. He may call. I had the uncomfortable conviction that if my grandfather called for us, it would be too late, but I forbore to give voices to my fear. The events of that evening started as before, with the strains of that weirdly beautiful music, welling flute-like from the darkness around the house. Then, in a little while, preceded by an aura of evil so great that it was almost stifling in the room. Then came something more, something unspeakably terrible. We had been sitting, Frolin and I, with the light out. I had not bothered to light my electric candle, since no light we could show would illumine the source of these manifestations. I faced the window, and when the wind began to rise, looked out once again to the line of trees, thinking that surely, certainly, they must bend before this great, onrushing storm of wind. But again there was nothing, no movement in that stillness, and there was no cloud in the heavens. The stars shone brightly, the constellations of summer moving down to the western rim of the earth to make the signature of autumn in the sky. The wind's sound had arisen steadily, so that now it had the fury of a gale, and yet nothing, no movement, disturbed the line of trees, dark upon the night sky. But suddenly, so suddenly that for a moment I blinked my eyes in an effort to convince myself that a dream had shattered my sight, in one large area of the sky, the stars were gone. I came to my feet and pressed my face to the pane. It was as if a cloud had abruptly reared up into the heavens, to a height of almost at the zenith, but no cloud could have come upon the sky so swiftly. On both sides and overhead, stars still shone. I opened the window and leaned out, trying to follow the dark outline against the stars. It was the outline of some great beast, a horrible caricature of man, rising to a semblance of a head high in the heavens, and there, where its eyes might have been, glowed with a deep, carmine fire, 2 stars. Or were they stars? At the same instant, the sound of those approaching footsteps grew so loud that the house shook and trembled with their vibrations, and the wind's demoniac fury rose to indescribable heights, and the ululation reached such a pitch that it was maddening to hear. "Frolin!" I cried hoarsely. I heard him come to my side, and in a moment felt his tight grasp on my arm. So he too had seen. It was not hallucination, not dream. This giant thing, outlined against the stars and moving. "It's moving," whispered Frolin. "Oh God, it's coming." He pulled frantically away from the window, and so did I. But in an instant the shadow on the sky was gone, the stars once more. The wind, however, not increased in intensity one iota. Indeed, if it were possible, it grew momentarily wilder and more violent. The entire house shuddered and quaked, while those thunderous footsteps echoed and re-echoed in the valley before the house, and the cold grew worse, so that breath hung, a white vapor in the air, a cold as of outer space. Well, outer space freezes air, so... Out of all the turmoil of mind, I thought of the legend in my grandfather's papers. The legend of Ipecac, whose signature lay in the cold and snow of far northern places. Even if I remembered, everything was driven from my mind by a frightful chorus of ululation, the triumphant chanting as of 1,000 bestial mouths. Ea, ea, Ipecac, Ipecac. Ae, 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 Ipecac, Kuf ayak, Volgatmum, Vagtul aglan, Volgatmum, Ipecac, Fatagan, Ag, ea, ea, ae, ae, ae. Simultaneously came a thunder crash, and immediately after, the voice of my grandfather raised in a terrible cry, a cry that rose into a scream of mortal terror, so that the names he would have uttered, Frolin's and mine, were lost, choked back into his throat by the full force of the horror revealed to him. And as abruptly as his voice ceased to sound, all other manifestations came to a stop, leaving again that ghastly, portentous silence to close around us like a cloud of doom. Frolin reached the door of my room before I did, but I was not far behind. He fell part of the way down the stairs, but recovered in the light of my electric candle, which I had seized on my way out, and together we assaulted the door of the study, calling to the old man inside, but no voice answered. Though the line of yellow under the door was evidence that his lamp burned still. The door had been locked from the inside, so that it was necessary to break it down before we could enter. Of my grandfather there was no trace, but in the east wall yawned a great cavity, where the painting now prone upon the floor had been, a rocky opening leading into the depths of the earth, and over everything in the room lay the mark of Ithaquois, a fine carpet of snow whose crystals gleamed as from a million tiny jewels in the yellow light of grandfather's lamp. Save for the painting, only the bed was disturbed, as if grandfather had been literally torn out of it by stupendous force. I looked hurriedly to where the old man had kept Uncle Leander's manuscript, but it was gone. Nothing of it remained. Frolan cried out suddenly and pointed to the painting Uncle Leander had made, and then to the opening yawning before us. It was here all the time, the threshold, he said, and I saw even as grandfather had seen too late, for the painting by Uncle Leander was but the representation of the site of his home before the house had been erected to conceal that cavernous opening into the earth on the hillside, the hidden threshold against which Leander's manuscript had warned, the threshold beyond which my grandfather had vanished. Though there was little more to tell, yet the most damning of all the curious facts remained to be revealed. A thorough search of the cavern was subsequently made by county officials and certain intrepid adventurers from Harmon. It was found to have several openings, and was plain that anyone or anything wishing to reach the house through the cavern would have had to enter through one of the innumerable hidden crevices discovered among the surrounding hills. The nature of Uncle Leander's activities was revealed after grandfather's disappearance. Frolan and I were put through a hard grilling by suspicious county officials, but were finally released when the body of my grandfather did not come to light. But since that night, certain facts came into the open facts, which in the light of my grandfather's hints, coupled with the horrible legends contained in the shunned books locked away here in the library of Miskatonic University, are damning and damnably inescapable. At first, the first of them was a series of gigantic footprints found in the earth at the place where, on that fatal night, the shadow had arisen in the star-swept heavens, the unbelievable wide and deep depressions as of some prehistoric monster walking there, steps half a mile apart, steps that led beyond the house and vanished at a crevice leading down into the hidden caverns, in tracks identical with those found in the snow in northern Manitoba, where those unfortunate travelers and a constable sent to find them had vanished from the face of the earth. The second was the discovery of my grandfather's notebook, together with a portion of Uncle Leander's manuscript, encased in ice, found deep in the forest of snows of upper Saskatchewan, and bearing every sign of having been dropped from great height. The last entry was dated on the day of his disappearance in late September. The notebook was not found until the following April. Neither Frolan nor I dared to make the explanation of its strange appearance, which came immediately to mind. And together we burned that horrible letter and the imperfect translation grandfather had made, the translation which in itself, as it was written down, with all its warnings against the terror beyond the threshold, had served to summon from outside a creature so horrible that its description has never been attempted by even those ancient writers, whose terrible narratives are scattered over the face of the earth. And last of all, the most conclusive, the most damning evidence, the discovery 7 months later of my grandfather's body on a small Pacific island not far southeast of Singapore, and the curious report made of his condition, perfectly preserved as if in ice, so cold that no one could touch him with bare hands for 5 days after his discovery. And the singular fact that he was found half buried in sand as if he had fallen from an airplane. Neither Frolan nor I could any longer have any doubt. This was the legend of Ithaquois, who carried his victims with him into far places of earth, in time and space, before leaving them behind. And the evidence was undeniable that my grandfather had been alive for part of that incredible journey. For if we had any doubt, the thing found in his pockets, the mementos carried from strange hidden places where he had been and sent to us were final and damning testimony. The gold plaque, with its miniature representation of a struggle between ancient beings and bearing on its surface inscriptions in Kabbalistic designs. The plague, which Dr. Rackham of Miskatonic University identified as having come from some place beyond the memory of man, the loathsome book in Burmese that revealed ghastly legends of that shunned and hidden plateau of Leng, the place of the dread Cho people, and finally the revolting and bestial stone miniature of a hellish monstrosity walking in the winds above the earth. Now, if we fear too much, that gives certain things a certain degree of power that they might not other have. And it takes, we got to respond to things, but don't just freeze.